He's not only a lawbreaker, but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself.
I just don't like him at all. I never liked him to begin with, and now I just feel like he just shows time and time again how much of a buffoon he is.
Boris Johnson lied. He lied to MPs. He lied to the people of this country.
Look, it's quite clear that he misled Parliament.
This is a man who is a serial liar. I mean, the history of his lying is just epic.
Welcome to the day. The fall from grace of former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson got its official seal today with a damning report from a powerful parliamentary committee. The House of Commons Privileges Committee found that Mr Johnson deliberately and repeatedly misled Parliament. That's a polite way of saying he lied. The verdict makes him the first British Prime Minister found to have lied to Parliament. Parliament had taken Mr Johnson to task over a series of parties he attended during the COVID lockdown. Matters, report said, of the greatest importance to the House and to the public, and about which he lied deliberately and repeatedly. Mr Johnson's allies have criticised the report as vindictive, and they'll get their chance to oppose it when MPs vote on it next Monday. For others, though, the fault lies with none other than Alexander Boris the Pfeffel Johnson.
The truth is, he has dug his own hole over this. It is the result of his own actions, and I'm afraid it's entirely of a piece with the way he's behaved over a long period, because this is a man who is a serial liar. I mean, the history of his lying is just epic. And so I'm afraid what he did at the dispatch box in the House of Commons when he was answering questions is all of a piece with his normal behaviour.
Well, I think the Privileges Committee is pretty damning. You know, it's serious. Boris Johnson is not only a lawbreaker, but a liar. He's not fit for public office and he's disgraced himself and continues to act like a, pound-shot Trump in the way in which he tries to discredit anybody who criticises his actions when actually a decent public servant would have done the honourable thing, would have had a little bit of humility and would have apologised to the British public for what they put them through.
Jim Gibbons is a journalist who was in Brussels when Mr Johnson was also there, carving out his career as a Europe-bashing journalist for one of Britain's most Eurosceptic national newspapers. Welcome to DW. Let's start with what has happened today. The British Parliament still has to vote on the committee's findings. Mr Johnson's Conservatives still have a 60-seat working majority. So are they likely to vote to save their man?
No, I don't think they will now. I think they realise that they've got a dead man, basically, in place. They can't do anything to save him. He's finished, I hope. Certainly from his record in Brussels, when he was there as a journalist and then as a politician, he was never really very effective, I have to say.
The committee had a Conservative majority, and in large part, Britain's ruling Conservative government owes its parliamentary majority to Boris Johnson. So why have they turned their backs on him?
They turned their backs on him because he's been shown to be less than entirely truthful, shall we say. I mean, years ago, I was walking across the passerelle in Brussels, that separates the two European Parliament buildings, and I was actually going to do an interview for Deutsche Welle, oddly enough. And on the other side of the passerelle, there was a lady who was working for the BBC, who was his sister-in-law. And Boris Johnson, she was in the middle of doing an interview for the BBC, camera rolling. Boris Johnson walked up to her and said, "Oh, hello!" Interrupted the interview, broke it up, in fact, and said, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" And she stopped the interview, walked across to the window and came back and said, "I just had to check if it's true, Boris, because you're such a liar."
OK, so, as I say, you've obviously then seen the man and his methods at work during your shared time there as a journalist at the EU headquarters. So it sounds like you don't find it at all surprising that he's been declared a liar.
No, not at all. I mean, he always has been. Everyone knew he was. The odd thing was that there were people there who were so conservative, and I mean right-wing conservative, that they were quite prepared to put up with his little peccadillos and his oddities. He wasn't always an unkind man. One time when I was mainly freelancing for local regional television in the UK, And I had a problem with a young man who turned up and started asking me what the stories were in the morning. And when I told him, I found out later that he'd phoned my client stations and offered to cover them for less money than I could. And Boris Johnson suggested in a pub next to the commission that he'd phone up and say he was from ITV and tell the man to go to Moscow, and we'd sort it out when he got there. I couldn't let him do that. I mean, all right, I didn't like the chap who was doing it, but I couldn't have left him stranded in Moscow. But Boris thought that would be an hilarious jape.
OK, so he's resigned. He resigned last week. This report into his misleading of Parliament was published this morning. Now he's gone. Does any of this really matter?
I don't know. It's very hard to tell at this point. He certainly had a very negative effect on government and on Parliament, I think, too, and certainly on the Conservative Party, because there are now a lot of people who did vote for him because they thought, big tough man, a bit of the sort of Trump type of support. You know, he's the tough guy in charge. But they've realised that he's really got feet of clay. He's not really all that he said he would be. He's a liar. He distorts the truth. He always tries to make himself come out looking good. And the fact is that he's made a complaint against one of the Conservative MPs for the simple reason that the chap said that he was complaining about Boris Johnson attending these parties when he was there too, which means that he wasn't denying that he'd organised the party, but merely that one of the men who attended it was complaining about him.
Right, so a couple of his supporters have now also resigned from Parliament, triggering by-elections, causing headaches for a party that Mr Johnson has professed to love. So are we now going to see weeks of this Conservative government tearing itself apart while Britain just wonders, or British people just wonder, well, how are we going to pay our electricity bills? How are we going to deal with this cost of living crisis?
I think it could be weeks. I hope it won't be, but Johnson himself wouldn't care about that. He's only interested in preserving himself, really. He's not interested in the effect that his resignation might have on ordinary voters. And he's still saying, not so very long ago, that he would stand again. And Rees-Mogg, the man that he's just given a knighthood to, is saying he'll be back one day and be back in charge of the party. I just can't see that happening. I don't see how a man can go so far back down the road and still come back to the leadership. It's just not possible, surely.
Good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, journalist Jim Gibbons.
My pleasure. Thank you.